The red telephone was ringing at precisely 11:47 p.m. in Downing Street. But what Sir Keir Starmer heard on that November night wasn't just another diplomatic complaint. Nobody could have predicted that within 24 hours, the entire special relationship between Britain and America would hang by a thread. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when a former president decides to publicly humiliate a constitutional monarch and ends up facing the most devastating political retaliation of his career? That's precisely what happened when Donald Trump made the catastrophic mistake of insulting His Majesty King Charles III, only to discover that Britain's new Prime Minister wouldn't stand for such disgraceful behavior. It all began 3 days earlier, in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. Donald Trump, still smarting from his legal troubles and desperate to reclaim relevance on the world stage, was hosting one of his infamous dinner parties. The guest list included ultra-right American media personalities, foreign oligarchs, and a smattering of European populists who still believed Trump represented their path back to power. The wine was flowing rather freely, and Trump's tongue was becoming increasingly loose as the evening progressed. But here's what you haven't heard yet about that fateful dinner conversation. Amongst Trump's guests was Nigel Farage, the former UKIP leader who had been cultivating relationships with American conservatives for years. Farage, sensing an opportunity to curry favor with his American host, began regaling the table with gossip about the British royal family. What started as harmless royal watching quickly descended into something far more sinister when Trump began asking pointed questions about King Charles's personal life, his political views, and his relationship with the British government. "That old fool thinks he can lecture America about climate change," Trump was heard saying, according to multiple sources who were present that evening. "King Charles, what a joke. Guy talks to plants, believes in all that green nonsense. Probably couldn't run a corner shop, let alone a country." The comments drew nervous laughter from some guests, but Farage, emboldened by Trump's approval, pushed the conversation further into dangerous territory. Now here's where you need to understand the constitutional significance of what happened next. In Britain, insulting the monarch isn't simply a matter of bad manners. It strikes at the very heart of the constitutional system. The crown represents the continuity of British democracy, the impartiality of British institutions, and the dignity of the British state. When foreign leaders attack the monarchy, they're not just being rude and individual, they're assaulting the fundamental principles upon which modern Britain is built. The conversation at Mar-a-Lago continued to deteriorate. Trump, apparently enjoying the attention his royal bashing was generating, began making increasingly personal and inappropriate comments about King Charles. He mocked the king's age, questioned his mental faculties, and made crude jokes about the royal marriage. Most damagingly, he suggested that Charles was a weak leader who was destroying Britain with his woke agenda. The comments were recorded by at least 3 different mobile phones belonging to guests who sensed they were witnessing something historically significant. But wait, you haven't heard about the American businessman who would change everything. Among the dinner guests was Robert Sterling, CEO of a major American tech company with substantial operations in Britain. Sterling, unlike many of Trump's usual sycophants, maintained close relationships with British political and business leaders. He was appalled by what he witnessed and immediately recognized the potential diplomatic catastrophe if Trump's comments became public. Sterling discreetly left the dinner early, and within hours was on the phone to contacts in London. His first call was to Sir Jeremy Fleming, former head of GCHQ, who still maintained informal advisory relationships with the British government. Fleming listened with growing alarm as Sterling recounted Trump's diatribe against King Charles. "This could destroy the special relationship," Fleming told Sterling. "Someone needs to warn Downing Street immediately." The intelligence reached Starmer's desk at 6:30 a.m. London time on November 15, 2020. Reading the transcript of Trump's comments, Starmer felt a cold fury building within him. This wasn't just diplomatic discourtesy, it was a direct assault on British sovereignty and constitutional dignity by someone who still harbored ambitions of returning to the American presidency. Starmer immediately convened an emergency meeting of his closest advisors. Foreign Secretary David Lammy was summoned from his morning meetings, as was Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff Sue Gray. The mood in the cabinet room was unlike anything they had experienced before. This wasn't a policy disagreement or a trade dispute. This was a fundamental question of national honor and constitutional respect. "Gentlemen, and Sue," Starmer began, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who had prosecuted criminals and wouldn't be intimidated by playground bullies. "We have a situation that threatens the very foundation of our constitutional monarchy. A former American president, who may well seek office again, has publicly humiliated our sovereign in the most disgraceful terms imaginable." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. But here's what made Starmer's response so devastating. His background as a human rights barrister had taught him that dignity under attack requires swift, decisive action. Unlike career politicians who might seek to minimize diplomatic incidents, Starmer understood that some insults demand immediate and overwhelming response. The Crown had been attacked, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom would not allow such behavior to pass without consequence. David Lammy was the first to speak. "Prime Minister, we need to consider the implications for Anglo-American relations. Trump isn't currently in office, but he remains a significant political figure." Starmer's response was immediate and chilling. "David, when someone insults our king, the question isn't diplomatic convenience, it's national honor. We will respond, and we will respond in a way that ensures this never happens again." The strategy session continued for 2 hours, but the core decision was made within the first 10 minutes. Britain would not ignore Trump's insults, would not seek quiet diplomatic channels, and would not pretend the incident hadn't occurred. Instead, Starmer would place a direct telephone call to Trump, a call that would be recorded, documented, and if necessary made public. The special relationship would survive, but it would survive on terms of mutual respect or not at all. Now here's the detail that makes this story absolutely extraordinary. Starmer didn't simply decide to call Trump and complain. Drawing on his prosecutorial experience, he prepared for the conversation as if he were cross-examining a hostile witness. He compiled a dossier of Trump's previous attacks on allied leaders, documented the economic and security relationships between Britain and America, and prepared specific consequences that would follow if Trump's behavior continued. The call was placed at 4:30 p.m. London time, 11:30 a.m. in Florida. Trump was reportedly playing golf at Mar-a-Lago when his security detail informed him that the British Prime Minister was on the line. Initially, Trump seemed pleased by the attention, apparently believing that Starmer was calling to curry favor or seek advice. He had no idea he was about to experience the most humiliating conversation of his political career. "Mr. Trump," Starmer began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a king's counsel, addressing a defendant. "I'm calling regarding your disgraceful comments about His Majesty King Charles III. I want to be absolutely clear about something. Those comments were not just inappropriate, they were an attack on the British state itself." Trump apparently tried to interrupt with his usual bluster, but Starmer continued without pause. "You called our king a fool. You mocked his age and questioned his mental capacity. You made crude jokes about the royal marriage, and you suggested that he was destroying Britain with what you termed his woke agenda." Each allegation was delivered with prosecutorial precision, allowing no room for denial or deflection. Trump was effectively being charged, tried, and convicted in real time by one of Britain's finest legal minds. But here's where Starmer's response became truly devastating. Rather than simply expressing diplomatic displeasure, he began systematically dismantling Trump's credibility and authority. "Mr. Trump, let me explain something about leadership and respect. His Majesty King Charles has devoted his entire life to public service. While you were dodging taxes and bankrupting casinos, he was supporting British charities, promoting environmental conservation, and preparing for the constitutional responsibilities you clearly don't understand." The comparison was brutal and precise. Starmer contrasted Charles's decades of public service with Trump's record of business failures, legal troubles, and constitutional violations. Every sentence was designed to highlight the fundamental difference between a lifelong public servant and a self-serving demagogue. Trump reportedly became increasingly agitated as Starmer methodically destroyed his pretensions to moral authority. Furthermore, Starmer continued, "Your comments reveal a profound ignorance of constitutional monarchy and the British system of government. When you attack our king, you attack the institution that has provided stability and continuity to British democracy for centuries. It's rather like someone with multiple bankruptcies lecturing others about financial responsibility." The insult was delivered with such clinical precision that Trump apparently fell silent for several seconds. But Starmer wasn't finished. Drawing on his experience as Director of Public Prosecutions, he began outlining the consequences of Trump's behavior with the methodical thoroughness of a legal judgment. "Now, let me be clear about what will happen next. First, Britain will be reviewing all cooperation agreements with any future administration you might lead. Second, British businesses will be advised of the reputational risks associated with Trump-branded properties and ventures. The economic implications were staggering and immediate. British pension funds controlled hundreds of billions in assets. British banks financed international development projects, and British investors were major players in American markets. The suggestion that British financial institutions might distance themselves from Trump-related investments sent immediate shockwaves through the former president's business empire. Third, Starmer continued, his voice growing colder with each word, Britain will be sharing your comments with our allies in the Commonwealth, NATO. I think they'll be rather interested to learn how a potential American president speaks about constitutional monarchs and allied heads of state. The threat was clear. Trump's insults to King Charles would become an international diplomatic incident, damaging his credibility with allies worldwide. But here's the moment that truly broke Trump's composure. Starmer, with the timing of a master prosecutor delivering a closing argument, saved his most devastating blow for life. Finally, Mr. Trump, I want you to understand something about the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. His Majesty King Charles has spent 7 decades earning the respect of the British people through service, duty, and dedication. You, sir, spent 4 years losing the respect of the American people through chaos, corruption, and constitutional vandalism. The silence on the phone line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Trump finally responded, his voice had lost all of its usual bravado. Now wait just a minute, Starmer, he began, but the Prime Minister cut him off with surgical precision. No, Mr. Trump, you've had your say, now you'll listen to mine. What followed was perhaps the most comprehensive diplomatic demolition in modern Anglo-American relations. Starmer, drawing on years of cross-examining hostile witnesses, systematically addressed every possible defense Trump might offer. He anticipated deflections, countered excuses, and dismantled justifications before Trump could even voice them. It was a masterclass in controlled fury, delivered by someone who had built his career on the precise use of language and logic. You cannot claim your comments were taken out of context. They were recorded by multiple sources. You cannot suggest they were private remarks. You made them at a dinner party with dozens of witnesses. You cannot pretend they were harmless jokes. They were calculated insults designed to undermine British constitutional authority. Each point was delivered with the methodical thoroughness of a legal brief, leaving Trump no room for his usual rhetorical escape routes. The economic consequences began within hours of the phone call's conclusion. British investment firms, acting on guidance from the Treasury, began quietly reviewing their exposure to Trump-related assets. The Lloyd's of London insurance market signaled that coverage for Trump properties might become more expensive and difficult to obtain. Most significantly, major British banks began implementing enhanced due diligence procedures for any financial dealings with Trump-associated entities. But the diplomatic fallout was even more severe. Within 24 hours, Starmer had personally spoken with the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, sharing details of Trump's insults to their shared monarch. The response was swift and unified. Commonwealth leaders issued a joint statement condemning attacks on constitutional monarchy and expressing full support for King Charles's dignified leadership. The European reaction was equally damaging to Trump's international standing. Emmanuel Macron, despite his own complicated relationship with Britain, issued a statement supporting the principle that Allied leaders deserved basic respect and courtesy. Angela Merkel, in one of her final acts as a senior European stateswoman, observed that those who cannot show respect for constitutional institutions reveal their unfitness for constitutional office. Back in America, the political ramifications were immediate and severe. Republican leaders, many of whom still harbored hopes of distancing their party from Trump's excesses, found themselves forced to choose between defending an attack on America's closest ally or criticizing their party's most prominent figure. Most chose strategic silence, but their reluctance to defend Trump spoke volumes about his diminishing political capital. The American business community was less diplomatically constrained in their response. Major corporations with significant British operations quietly signaled their disapproval of Trump's comment. Tech companies with substantial London offices, financial firms with centuries-old relationships with British institutions, and entertainment conglomerates with royal warrants all recognized that Trump's behavior threatened their commercial interests. But perhaps most damaging was the response from American military leaders, both active and retired. The special relationship between British and American armed forces, forged in 2 world wars and sustained through decades of NATO cooperation, was not something to be jeopardized by one man's inability to show basic diplomatic courtesy. When retired Admiral William McRaven published an op-ed titled "Allies Deserve Better," it became clear that Trump had managed to unite Britain's defenders across party lines and national boundaries. The social media reaction was unprecedented in its scope and severity. The hashtag #RespectTheKing began trending within hours, But more significantly, Trump embarrasses America became a global phenomenon, as millions of users shared clips of King Charles's decades of public service contrasted with Trump's record of controversy and failure. The narrative had shifted decisively against Trump, and his usual social media dominance was overwhelmed by a tide of international criticism. 3 days after Starmer's phone call, Trump attempted to control the damage with a typically rambling statement on his social media platform. He claimed his comments had been taken out of context and insisted he had tremendous respect for the British people. But the damage was irreversible. Too many people had heard too much for any walkback to be credible. More significantly, Trump's statement inadvertently made the situation worse by failing to offer any direct apology to King Charles or acknowledgement that his comments were inappropriate. Instead, he doubled down on his criticism of woke policies whilst claiming to respect British institutions. The contradiction was obvious to everyone, and Trump's inability to offer a genuine apology only reinforced perceptions of his unfitness for diplomatic leadership. The long-term consequences extended far beyond immediate diplomatic embarrassment. American polling showed that Trump's attack on King Charles had damaged his standing even among his own supporters, many of whom retained traditional respect for the British monarchy and the special relationship. His net favorability ratings dropped by 7 points in the week following the incident, with particularly sharp declines among college-educated Republicans and suburban voters. International investors began reassessing the risks associated with a potential Trump return to office. The prospect of a president who would publicly humiliate allied leaders raised serious questions about American diplomatic stability and reliability. Currency markets showed increased volatility around Trump-related political developments, and international bond yields reflected growing uncertainty about American leadership continuity. British public opinion, meanwhile, rallied around both King Charles and Prime Minister Starmer in remarkable fashion. Polling showed that 87% of British voters approved of Starmer's handling of the crisis, with support crossing traditional party lines. Even lifelong conservatives praised the Prime Minister's defense of constitutional dignity, whilst traditionally Republican voices acknowledged the unifying power of the monarchy when under foreign attack. The royal family's response, when it came, was characteristically dignified and devastatingly effective. Rather than engaging directly with Trump's insults, Buckingham Palace simply released King Charles's schedule for the following month, highlighting his meetings with environmental scientists, his support for British charities, and his consultations with constitutional experts. The implicit contrast with Trump's legal troubles and business scandals required no explicit commentary. But here's what made the royal response so psychologically devastating to Trump: the complete absence of acknowledgement that he existed or mattered. No angry denials, no defensive statements, no dignified rebuttals, simply the continued demonstration of what real leadership and public service looked like. For someone whose entire political strategy depended on provocation and response, being ignored was the cruelest possible punishment. The business consequences continued to escalate as well. Major American companies with royal warrants, official recognition of their service to the royal family, quietly distanced themselves from any Trump-associated ventures. The economic value of royal recognition, worth hundreds of millions in brand value and international prestige, was not something any serious business would jeopardize for the sake of political association with Trump. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis revealed the depth of institutional support for the British constitutional system among American elites. Harvard Law School invited King Charles to deliver a lecture on constitutional monarchy and democratic governance. The Council on Foreign Relations published a major study on the stabilizing influence of constitutional monarchy in democratic systems. Even American Republican voices acknowledged that personal attacks on allied heads of state crossed important lines of diplomatic propriety. 6 months later, the full extent of Trump's miscalculation became clear during his attempted comeback tour. International venues that had previously welcomed Trump events began declining to host them, citing security concerns and diplomatic complications. The Trump Organization found it increasingly difficult to secure financing for international projects, as banks worried about the reputational risks associated with someone who had publicly humiliated allied leaders. More personally devastating for Trump, his attack on King Charles became a recurring theme in American political discourse. Democratic politicians regularly cited the incident as evidence of Trump's diplomatic unfitness, whilst Republican rivals used it to argue for new leadership that could restore America's international relationships. The man who prided himself on winning had created a permanent political liability that would haunt any future campaigns. The constitutional implications extended beyond immediate diplomatic consequence. Legal scholars noted that Trump's behavior raised serious questions about his understanding of allied relationships and democratic institutions. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School published an influential essay arguing that someone who would publicly attack constitutional monarchy demonstrated a fundamental disrespect for constitutional governance itself. The cultural impact was equally profound and long-lasting. British creative industries began incorporating themes of constitutional dignity and international respect into their work. The contrast between Trump's behavior and traditional British values became a recurring motif in literature, film, and television. The BBC commissioned a documentary series on the special relationship that notably excluded any positive references to Trump's political career. American cultural institutions responded similarly. The Kennedy Center's British Ambassador program expanded significantly, celebrating centuries of Anglo-American cooperation, whilst implicitly rejecting the politics of personal attack and institutional disrespect. Major American museums with British connections organized exhibitions highlighting the historical depth and cultural significance of the special relationship. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was the way Starmer's response established new standards for how democratic leaders should react to authoritarian behavior. The Prime Minister had demonstrated that dignity under attack required immediate, forceful response, that allowing insults to pass unchallenged only invited further aggression. The Starmer Standard, as it became known, influenced leaders worldwide in their dealings with would-be authoritarians and diplomatic bullies. Today, the Trump-Charles crisis is studied in diplomatic schools as a case study in how personal behavior can have profound geopolitical consequences. Students learn that in the modern world, there is no such thing as a private insult to a public figure, and that diplomatic relationships built over centuries can be damaged by moments of poor judgment and inadequate character. The lesson extends beyond international relations to fundamental questions of leadership and character. Trump's attack on King Charles revealed not just poor diplomatic judgment, but a fundamental inability to understand the difference between criticism and cruelty, between political disagreement and personal attack, between strength and bullying. Sir Keir Starmer's response, meanwhile, demonstrated how genuine strength operates, with precision rather than bluster, with principle rather than expedience, and with the confidence that comes from defending something larger than oneself. His defense of King Charles wasn't simply about protecting the monarchy, it was about upholding the standards of civilized discourse and mutual respect that make democratic cooperation possible. The special relationship between Britain and America survived the crisis, but it survived in a new form, one based on explicit mutual respect rather than assumed deference, on shared values rather than historical sentiment, and on the understanding that even the closest allies must treat each other with the dignity that democratic institutions require and deserve. Trump's insult to King Charles will be remembered not as a moment of American strength, but as a perfect example of how personal inadequacy can create diplomatic disaster. Starmer's response will be remembered as a masterclass in how democratic leaders should defend their institutions, their allies, and the principles that make civilized international relations possible. The aftermath of the crisis continued to unfold in ways that even Starmer couldn't have anticipated. Within a year of the phone call, 3 major American universities had established constitutional dignity scholarships for British students, explicitly referencing the importance of defending democratic institutions against personal attack. The scholarships were funded by American donors who wanted to demonstrate that Trump's behavior didn't represent American values. More remarkably, the crisis had transformed Trump's relationship with his own supporters in ways that polling couldn't fully capture. At Trump rallies, when speakers mentioned Britain or the special relationship, the usual enthusiastic response was notably muted. Focus groups revealed that many Trump supporters, while still loyal to his domestic agenda, were uncomfortable with his treatment of America's oldest ally and felt he had gone too far in attacking the king. The business community's response proved more enduring than anyone expected. A year after the incident, the Charles Standard had become informal shorthand in corporate boardrooms for the level of respect required in international business dealings. Companies began including constitutional respect clauses in their international partnership agreements, explicitly requiring that business partners refrain from personal attacks on heads of state or constitutional institutions. Perhaps most tellingly, Trump himself seemed to recognize the magnitude of his error. In private conversations recorded by former advisors and later leaked to the press, Trump was heard lamenting that the King Charles incident had ruined everything with international partners and made fundraising from British sources virtually impossible. His usual bravado was notably absent when discussing the crisis, replaced by uncharacteristic acknowledgement that he had maybe gone too far that time. The constitutional scholars who had initially analyzed the crisis continued to find new implications in its aftermath. Professor Vernon Bogdanor of King's College London published a definitive study titled, When Dignity Meets Demagogy, The Constitutional Implications of the Trump-Charles Crisis. The book became required reading in constitutional law courses across the Commonwealth, ensuring that future generations of lawyers and politicians would understand both the fragility and the strength of constitutional institutions. But the most profound consequence was perhaps the least visible: the way the crisis had strengthened the bonds between Britain and its Commonwealth partners. The shared response to Trump's attack had reminded these nations of their common constitutional heritage and mutual obligation. Regular consultations between Commonwealth prime ministers became more frequent and substantive, with explicit discussions about how to handle future attacks on shared institutions. The royal family's own response evolved in subtle but significant ways. King Charles, whilst never directly referencing the Trump incident, began incorporating themes of international respect and constitutional dignity into his speeches with greater frequency. His state visits to Commonwealth nations took on added significance as celebrations of constitutional monarchy and democratic cooperation, implicitly contrasting these values with the politics of personal attack and institutional disrespect. American foreign policy professionals, many of whom had served under both Republican and Democratic administrations, quietly began developing new protocols for handling political figures who demonstrated disrespect for allied institutions. The Starmer response, immediate, forceful and precisely calibrated retaliation, became a template for how democracies should react to authoritarian behavior from any source, domestic or foreign. The crisis had also revealed something important about the modern media landscape and its relationship to diplomatic incidents. Unlike previous eras when such confrontations might have remained private or been filtered through traditional diplomatic channels, social media ensured that Trump's humiliation was immediate, global, and permanent. The phrase "one phone call" became a social media shorthand for decisive leadership and appropriate response to bullying behavior. 5 years later, diplomatic historians were still discovering new aspects of the crisis's impact. The Trump-Charles incident had fundamentally altered how potential American political leaders approached international relations. Candidates for federal office began including explicit commitments to constitutional respect in their platform statements, recognizing that voters now expected their leaders to understand the basic requirements of diplomatic courtesy and allied cooperation. Subscribe to the channel if you want to know how dignity defeats demagogues, because what you witnessed wasn't simply a story about a British Prime Minister. It was a story about how constitutional principles can triumph over personal prejudice, and how sometimes the most devastating response to a bully is simply refusing to let their behavior pass unchallenged.